Welcome to all the esteemed panelists, distinguished guests, and passionate advocates of technological advancement and responsible governance. Today, we gather here to delve into a topic of paramount importance in our rapidly evolving digital era: international AI regulations catalyzing innovations while ensuring security, trust, and accountability. As we stand at the cusp of technological revolution, the extraordinary growth and deep integration of AI into society worldwide have made it clear that a robust and comprehensive governance structure is not just desirable, but essential. We live in a time where harmonization of technology, policy, ethics, and social needs is not just a theoretical concept, but a practical imperative. This panel discussion is set against a backdrop where a swift momentum of AI, spearheaded by GPI Nation, is going to reshape the world. AI governance has emerged as a cornerstone in this landscape, dictating the trajectory of AI responsible growth and integration. However, the path to effective governance is riddled with complexities and challenges. It demands international collaboration grounded in universal principles of responsibility and ethics to ensure that development and deployment of AI serves the greater good. Yet, the road ahead is not without hurdles. AI influence spans a myriad of global issues, from climate change to essential sectors such as health and education. The lack of clear progress metrics in AI governance poses a significant challenge in evaluating the effectiveness of various approaches. Moreover, geographical imbalances and differing priorities between global south and global north add layers of complexities in this endeavor. As we embark on today's discussion, let us remember that the essence of international collaboration in AI governance, it is the beacon that guides us towards the future where AI is developed and deployed in not just with the technological precision, but with a moral compass that aligns with our shared values of responsibility and ethics. With these thoughts in mind, I would now like to invite our esteemed panelists for today's session to join me on the stage. Mr. Abhishek Singh, Additional Secretary, MeitY. Thank you. Ms. Sue Daly, Director, Technology and Innovation, Tech UK. Ms. Baratang Mia, Founder and CEO, Girl Hype Women Who Code. Ms. Thomas Schneider, Chair of Council of Europe Committee on AI. Mr. David Weller, Senior Director at Google for Government Affairs and Public Policy, Google. Ms. Mary Snap, Vice President, Strategic AI Initiatives, Microsoft. And Ms. Kerrine Persett, Head of AI Unit of OECD Division for Digital Economy Policy. Thank you so much. So before we dive into our panel discussion, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's session, Mr. Abhishek Singh, Additional Secretary, MeitY. Sir has a wealth of experience in governance and policy formulation and a deep understanding of the intricacies of AI and its global impact. He's exceptionally positioned to guide us through today's dialogue. Please join me in welcoming him. And with that, I hand it over to Sir to lead us into what promises to be a thought-provoking and enlightening session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sukanya, for this interesting introduction. And I am amazed at the panel of speakers that we have today and the audience that we have on this Wednesday morning after the deliberations that we had yesterday in the inaugural day of the GPA Summit 2023. Yesterday we had long sessions in which some of the issues related to were discussed. In fact, even in the official Executive Council, Ministerial Council, the agenda is something that we'll be discussing today. But given the diversity, given the experts that we have on the panel, we'll be able to get the perspective from various angles. Amandeep will be joining from who is the UN Tech Envoy, the UN Advisory Group. We have OECD, who has been leading the efforts on AI governance, AI regulation, how AI should be shaped up. The OECD principles have been long-standing guiding principles. We have the tech experts from none other than the Google and Microsoft who very often determine what is to be done. We have Thomas Schneider, who has been like leading the efforts in Europe with regard to how AI should be regulated. We have Bartang, who has been like a pioneer when it comes to like how do we ensure balance, how do we ensure fairness, how do we ensure inclusion. So her insights will be very, very great. Sue Daly from UK. So we have a complete overview from the UN to the OECD to the European Union to the UK and to the big tech and from the civil society inclusion perspective. So we'll head straight into the topic, which reads like International AI Regulation Catalyzing Security, Trust and Accountability. So when we look at that, the various dimensions, the ecosystem in which we are living in. We had the G7 Hiroshima process, which laid down how GPA and G7 will work in shaping the governance mechanisms and how AI should evolve. We had the UK Bletchley AI Safety Summit, which came down like in what ways the world can come together to ensure that we are able to be safe, secure from the developments in frontier AI. And the declaration that came in and the follow-up that's going to happen in Korea and France sets the backdrop for this. And the G20 declaration also came up with similar declaration like how the world needs to work together, how do we need to harmonize the regulations, how do we need to create an ecosystem in which we can have an ideal balance between innovation and regulation. So I would start the conversation today with Karin and Karin Perset from OECD. And OECD has been at the forefront and a very important stakeholder as part of GPA also, and they have been playing a key role in the development of overall AI governance framework, the OECD principles and all. And from that point of view, I would like to ask, what's the importance of having a harmonized and common understanding of the term artificial intelligence across borders? How can we work towards a technology-neutral definition of AI which can stand the test of time given the ever-evolving and unpredictable nature of AI?
Thank you. That's a very good question. And definitions are always hard. But they're harder the longer you wait. So if you have different definitions being adopted in by different organizations or different jurisdictions, then it gets harder to. So we developed the first definition of an AI system in 2018-19 with an expert group composed of technical experts, researchers, policymakers, business representatives, and so on. And that definition was the only sort of internationally agreed definition of an AI system. And lately, we updated the definition slightly just to make it very clear that it covered also new types of AI that have appeared since then, like generative AI. So we added the word content, and we also added a few more words characterizing what an AI system, what it does, characterizing that it can adapt over time in some cases. And then it's very complicated, of course, to get a consensus on what an AI system is. And it took us a year for just a few words difference. But this is accompanied by an explanatory memorandum that gives a lot of detail of exactly why we picked which words and what these things mean in the context of the definition.
Yeah. Thank you. In fact, the right perspectives, and that's where we need to, like, as technology evolves, how do we ensure that when we look at definitions, keeps pace with the evolution of technology, and especially with generative AI, that's become very, very obvious. This brings me to Sue Daly, who has been leading the work on innovation, on technology deployment as part of Tech UK, and you've been working with various entities in trying to ensure so. So what do you think are the challenges and opportunities we face in harmonizing AI governance globally, considering the diverse interest priorities of various nations?
Yeah, and another a great question. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of GPA and this wonderful panel. Got slight imposter syndrome, but here we go. Wonderful question. Opportunities and challenges in having a globalized and harmonized approach to AI regulation. I think to be clear and to start off, there's huge opportunities if we can get this right and move forward, because a clear understanding of the rules and requirements around AI governance is vital for increasing and maintaining trust and confidence in these powerful, wonderful technologies that are continually evolving. And trust and confidence, as we all know, is key to adoption, deployment, and use. So if we're going to realize the full economic and social potential of these technologies, then making sure that we recognize that there are still concerns, ethical concerns, privacy concerns, security, safety concerns that we need to address. So the opportunity really is that if we can develop a harmonized approach, if there's clarity and certainty, and that's something that I think is really, really key around the rules, it will build that trust and confidence. But equally, clarity and certainty is also important for the continued development of the AI industry and the AI sector, which is obviously fueling our AI revolution. So industry want to do the right thing. They want to follow the rules. They want to develop new innovative tools and solutions, but they want to do it in a way that then can be deployed and used. And having clarity and certainty in terms of the rules and the requirements that are being asked of them is really, really key, particularly on a global approach, because a lot of companies in the UK are operating in the UK, but are looking to operate in the EU. They're looking to operate in the global south, looking to operate internationally. So a real issue, and perhaps this comes onto the challenge, is that understanding of how the different international approaches, and I'm not just talking about multinational approaches, but on a national basis, how the rules, how the legal frameworks that are being developed in particular countries or areas, how they all work together. So there's a real concern from industry, particularly SMEs, so particularly those smaller companies. And Tech UK, we have over 1,000 member companies in our membership, 2/3 of which are SMEs. They are the innovators. They are the companies that drive the digital ecosystem. How are they going to stay on top? How are they going to understand the rules and requirements as they're changing? And how do they all fit together? So it's that as we talk about moving from principles to practice and operationalizing the global approaches, which we very much support, how they all fit together, and that clarity and certainty, because they want to be able to follow the rules, they want to be able to do business across the world. But I think that's a challenge that we will have to face together as we move from not just, of course, the discussions that we're having right now, but as we move into operationalizing these global approaches to governance of AI. Thank you.
Very, very relevant, and that's like almost the entire industry always faces. Like if there are different laws, different regulations across, then how do we adapt and how do we ensure that we are able to comply with all of them? So that brings me to Thomas Schneider, who is the chair of the Council of Europe Committee on AI, and he has been like one of the persons who has been behind almost all the key documents we always refer to, the OECD principles or the UNESCO ethics framework. So given your expertise and with the recent EU Act being notified, how do you see this shaping up? How do you see the global AI regulatory space with the US, the memo that they issued in October, the declarations that various sovereign governments are happening, the EU Act that's coming up, and the whole talk about creating a regulatory framework of AI? How do you see this evolving with the pace at which technology is changing?
Yes, thank you, and good morning to everyone. I think when we look about AI, many things are new, but not everything is new. We also had disruptive technologies that have been invented in the past, and we have learned to develop a governance system. So if we take engines in the Industrial Revolution, it's not the same, but there are some parallels that we could actually have us inspired from. There is today not one single engine law across the world, or not even in one country. We have hundreds and thousands of technical, legal, but also social, cultural ways of regulating aspects of the use of engine. And you can put the same engine into a car or into a ship, and it may be differently regulated. And not just the engine, but mostly we do not regulate the engine itself, but we regulate the machine that the engine is driving. We regulate the people that are using the engines, and you have different regulations if you drive a bus, school bus, or if you drive a truck, or if you drive your own car. You have certain amount of harmonization. In the airline business, for instance, if you take planes, it is very harmonized, whereas if you take the cars, Here you drive on the other side of the road, like in my country, but we can still drive in each other's roads with a little bit more attention maybe. And you have cultural differences of dealing with risks. Even in Europe, if you look at how car traffic is regulated, you see quite some different. The Germans have no speed limits on certain motorways, others have very strict speed limits. And the same will probably have to happen to AI, that you have to have a number of different sets of technical norms, of legal norms, and of social cultural norms. And we will, in the interest of all, we try to harmonize them to the extent possible, but there will be still different ways of prioritization, of dealing with risks from culture to culture, different legal traditions. And so this is going to be something that we'll have to develop over the next years and decades. And what we should not forget is that we already have existing laws, existing international agreements on fundamental rights, on other values, on social rights, and so on, that of course also apply to AI. And what we are trying to do now at the Council of Europe is to develop the first binding treaty on AI. And for those that do not know the Council of Europe, this is not the European Union. The European Union has 27 member states. The Council of Europe is like the UN of Europe that has 46 member states. It has thousands of soft law instruments, but 200 something binding treaties, and many of them, including this one, is not a treaty for Europe, but it's meant to be a global treaty. So we have a growing number of non-European countries participating as equals, like the US, Canada, Japan, but also countries like Mexico, Argentina, Uruguay, Costa Rica, Australia, that have joined the negotiations. It's also open to any country that respects rule of law, democracy, and human rights in their own ways. And this is the challenge. We have to find a common ground on the level of principles that are globally shared. So we cannot just rely on the European institutions, on the European logic, but on a global logic. But the common ground is the international agreements that all of our countries, or most of our countries, have signed. And this is going to be one of the elements. It's going to be one binding principle agreement, complementing national agreements, complementing technical standards, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, thank you. That's a very interesting perspective, and the work that the Council of Europe is doing will definitely be something that we all can look up and try to see how we can harmonize our own approaches in order to say that there is a common minimum compliance criteria with regard to development of AI solutions. But I really like the analogy with regard to the automobiles and vehicles and development of that. Like we do have norms, like while engine standards are there, then every country has their norms of issuing driving licenses, norms about how you drive the vehicle, certification, pollution, EV charging ports, all of that there is an analogy, but also it leads to that there can be different regulations in different countries. And that brings me to Mary Snap from Microsoft, who leads the strategic AI initiatives there. So given the role that Microsoft has been playing in development of AI, and especially with generative AI, with your partnership with OpenAI, and given this evolving regulatory framework globally, and if there are different regulations in different countries, how does a company like Microsoft, which operates in different geographies, ensure that you are able to push forward your agenda of responsible AI development in the changing regulatory ecosystem?
Thank you very much. It's just an honor to be here today. I really appreciate the summit founders inviting me. Barateng, my co-panelist, told me that she has been to India 8 times in the last year, and this is my first. So I really appreciate the warm welcome. You ask a really great question. I would say that we have started thinking about artificial intelligence in 2018, so 6 or 7 years ago. We began with a committee to really look at the responsible uses of AI, and then a couple of years later, in 2019, we actually formed a department within our legal and external affairs group to think about responsible uses of AI. And this department really works with our product engineering teams that are spread out among 350 champions within engineering teams to really understand the impact of any use that we make of AI in our products, and those that are more sensitive uses, come back to that team that was created in 2019 to really examine on a iterative, very manual process what the impact might be. The team is composed of not only lawyers, but sociologists, anthropologists, other policy people, as well as engineers. So it's a very, very diverse team. But as we think about how we deploy artificial intelligence and generative AI, we think about a framework of 4 or 5 different things. And a number of the panelists have identified some of them, but to go just a click down, I think first of all, we would say, let us look at the standards frameworks that today exist and see what we can adapt and borrow from. And that might be something we've learned from privacy or security or digital safety, or it might mean an international standards body that thinks about science and technology. So let's look to what we have, first of all, we would say. Second is, we really believe that we need to have a regulatory framework. And that framework really should be based on the technology stack. And so if you think about it, you start at the very highest level, the applications, so the kinds of uses that you all are making of AI every day in your products and services, and ensure that we apply the laws and regulations that already exist, that potentially adapt and that focus on things such as unconscious bias and fairness. At a little bit further down, you've got the large language models, which are actually the huge body of data that enables us to really acquire answers and get them formulated in such a way that they're actually useful. There will be an important need for a trustworthy development of those large language models and ensuring that some of those are also registered and in a standardized way. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of these large language models. So, again, this is this process of setting standards and goals and allowing individual innovation with the development of the technology. Further down in the stack, you actually have the data centers where the data, resides. They are all over the world. I understand that there are at least 2 data centers in India with maybe 1 more to come. It is important that those data centers are as secure as possible. And that means secure on the exterior perimeter, but also secure in terms of cybersecurity. So as we think about those kinds of things, you've got that framework. Apply the standards that we can apply today. It's also important that we understand that humans need to be in control, that there will need to be some safety breaks. There will need to be places where we have built safety in by design, but there will need to be a failover and a sensitive use or a particular use in a critical infrastructure when the human is always in control of the ultimate decision making. So the artificial intelligence acts as a co-pilot, as a legal intern, if you will, for those of you who have that sort of a background, but that a human stays in control. The fourth thing that we would say is that it is incredibly important that we share information, best resources, particularly with academic and research institutions around the world, because it is important to ensure that the information and the technology is democratized so that it can be used by all. Which leads to the fifth thing, and I know other panelists will focus on, which really, how can we use the technology for social good? I look at the examples in India, the digital social goods and digital public infrastructure, and see things like the payment system, and see things like pensions and those sorts of things, which are really made much more efficient by artificial intelligence and enables us to really address those social good issues through public and private partnerships with the government, with companies like Microsoft and Google, with nonprofits, with government agencies. So that is sort of the broad framework that we think about that can be adopted, we hope, on a worldwide basis. The goal is really to harmonize at those high framework levels, but to allow individual innovation, not only by companies, but by countries as well. So I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
No, thank you, Mary, for your very insightful insights ranging from a diverse range of subjects. And that also kind of brings in how even the big tech companies are actually thinking about responsible AI framework and complying to that. That brings me to you, David, because Google is again another company which is building large language models, will building AI products, which has a storehouse of data available to them, accessible to them. So given the way technology is evolving, how do you think companies like Google can work with international organizations and governments to strike a balance between innovation and responsible AI governance to ensure that the technology that is developed is compliant with the ethical standards that are being imposed?
Well, thanks. Thanks so much, and it's great to be here, and I agree with what a lot of what has been said. I really like the way that you pose the question, because probably India is not a place where people snowboard, because there's probably maybe in the far north of India, but in snowboarding, like skateboarding, there's something called a half pipe, right? And you go up on one side or the other. And I feel like over the past couple of years, we have been in a half pipe regarding AI, of going from extreme discussion or sort of focused, exclusive discussion about risks and concerns and responsibility of all different types to AI is going to solve all problems and the incredible promise of AI. And we need to have, we need to be talking about both, and B, we need to be doing it in a way that that is factoring in how one relates to the other. So I think it's really important that as we think about incentives for companies and for the whole ecosystem, that we're focused on both things. And I think international governance has a really key role to play here. On the sort of one side of the half pipe, and again, I don't think we should go fully to the top. We should be somewhere in between on each side. But dealing with the risks issues, there obviously are real issues. We are never going to fulfill the promise of AI without building that trust. What does that mean at the international level? And I think of sort of three elements. The first is really alignment on standards. We see this in cybersecurity and privacy and other areas. Most every government, most people actually have pretty common values about what we see around AI. And you will see 50 different governments say they want to promote trust in AI, and they'll articulate some of the core values around that similarly. How do you actually measure that? Right? There's this old saying, I think Lord Kelvin, that, like, you know, if you can't measure it, it's not meaningful, right? So how do you measure that? How do you actually set the standard and then show assurance to it? And there's very good work happening at the ISO and the subcommittee 42 on AI, on risk management framework. Just as I said, just like we've seen in cybersecurity and other areas, we need to really work on that issue so that 5 different companies from different countries can give some we are incentivized to work towards some common standards, then we can show to the external world. So that's international standards. The second core piece is having some common regulatory approaches. Every government is going to regulate in different ways, but there should be some element of harmonization, and there are a couple of principles there. Things like taking a risk-based approach, not taking a one-size-fits-all approach for AI. And I think your engine examples, Thomas, were terrific. And then the third is really cooperation around research, right? Again, most governments in the world are thinking about some of the same issues around sort of some of the medium and longer term safety risks around AI systems, whether it be exfiltration or data poisoning or whatever it may be, which we don't have clear answers to, and let's work together on research on that. And then I just want to take 1 minute to talk about sort of the other side of the half pipe, which we tend to, in the governance space, spend less time on, right? And I think sometimes there's this assumption, governments just need to worry about the risk, the opportunity stuff will just happen. Hey, that's not the case. And I think looking at the last generation of new technology, where again, and my company was guilty of this a bit too, that we thought, you know, the internet was going to solve all of the world's problems. It doesn't. It doesn't happen automatically, right? There are other things that we need to do in terms of broader political, economic, social policy to ensure that these technologies truly benefit everyone and that the private sector is working on the right issues. And so the three things that I would just highlight there are, one, innovation infrastructure, right? Our government's providing the right incentives for inclusive innovation, for using data, for instance, that is broadly representative in how they develop models. Two, AI-empowered workforce, right? Companies will work on this individually, but governments can really set the standard, set challenges for companies like Google and Microsoft and others to work together and make big commitments on education in schools and education in workers. And then finally, broad, inclusive deployment, right? We can develop, our brilliant AI engineers can develop the most incredible technologies. Hey, if, the medical device regulator in country X or Y doesn't approve the new diagnostic tool, which is going to diagnose breast cancer, for instance, much more effectively than human systems. Hey, we've done some great research work, but it's not making a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting perspective, and that's where we need to think of like which way the governments can approach this whole issue of innovation and regulation, especially. And what we have seen this is that countries like, for example, India, where DPI has been used extensively for transforming lives, we always see as technology is a big enabler and for solving societal problems, because otherwise the alternative is that people don't have access to quality healthcare. So why not, if we are not able to provide real doctors, can we replace them with the AI tool which is better than going to a quack or going to somebody who is not medically qualified. But that also brings in like this whole issue of balance between ethical considerations and the need for empowering people, need for inclusion, need for ensuring that all segments of society, all countries at a larger level are equally covered. And when we develop technology, it should not become that there are haves and there are have-nots. And it should not, the present state of technology, that there are a few corporations, a few countries who have larger access to technology and the larger world is not. And that brings me to Bartang Mia. She has been working at this inclusion issue, like how do we ensure that girls get an opportunity, women get an opportunity to play a big key role in the technology sector? How do we ensure equitable development, inclusive development of technology without any bias and fairness? And we are looking at similar issues with AI at the larger level. How do you think we can make AI more inclusive, more ethical, more responsive?
Thank you very much for the question. That's like putting my imposter syndrome at a high level. But I think I just need to say that maybe my explanation would be based on my story. So I got interested in AI in 2016 after Microsoft introduced a chatbot called Tay. Tay was introduced and lasted 1.5 days. For those who don't know, you just do a bit of research about Tay. They launched a chatbot that I was so excited to be part of. Within half a day, I was like, what garbage is this? Because what was put by the people outside of Microsoft. So Microsoft had designed this chatbot. Let's forgive them and the engineers and everybody, they weren't biased. But the people, us, the people outside Microsoft who was using Tay, we fed that chatbot with very, very dangerous content that in a split second I realized this is how the global world think. And I told myself that I think I should shift from what I was doing, because for 15 years I had been teaching girls how to code. And as a software engineer, you focus on solving problems. It doesn't matter what, any software engineer, when they sit in front of a computer, they're solving problems. When do they think about ethical considerations is something that even myself, I'm still asking myself. If I'm gonna ask a software engineer to continually think about ethical consideration, it's going to stifle their innovation, because you have to work with algorithms. However, the only way for me, I think we could be able to limit that is by involving stakeholders right from the beginning. research, education, invest in infrastructure. Basics, invest in internet and computers in Africa. I am a black woman sitting in front of a crowd that, when I say I'm a black woman, might not understand that I've been in rooms where I had to fight for my voice to be heard. The people invite me, they included me, they asked me to be there. But when I raise my challenges and my issues, they are so minute. So the issues that are facing women has nothing to do with technology. It has everything to do with health and mental wellness of men who think women don't deserve to be on the table, who don't promote women, who build apps and content that is really discriminatory towards women. Now, if you're a black woman, it's double the dose, because they were educated by the culture and the system that really moved black women to the bottom of the chain. So when I walk into any meeting, I immediately have to put on my double dose of, they're gonna have to hear me. And if they don't hear me, it's okay. You know, I was sitting on a G20 working group and I had to fight for the word fairness to be included on DPIs. And the whole committee, I had one person who was like, as a South African, she has to have fairness there. Because you have to understand, fairness means different things to other people. If stakeholder engagement, when you say fairness, the business world is saying, yeah, it has to be fair to us. The stakeholder, civil society will say, hey, it has to be fair on us. The government say, I don't give a damn, because they're gonna do whatever they want anyhow. All I care about, we have to educate men, especially white men who are designing tech, to understand that there's human dignity, humanity is important, and as a black woman, I'm a human that's going to survive the impact of AI that they're building. And in closing, I think there are three things that always stand up for me is, I got this from ChatGPT, by the way. It's fairness and non-discrimination. So now I'm going to read my notes, but they literally came from ChatGPT. So I know that white men know this. All I'm saying is we need to focus on teaching, on working on their mental wellness and educate them differently on how to treat people. Because nobody wakes up in the morning saying, I'm going to be horrible to anyone. And I know, I work with software engineers, trust me. None of them wakes up in the morning and say, I'm going to bake horrible principles into data that's going with AI. It happens because the data sets of the people sitting in the community that are using internet are the ones who have it. Unless we address the issue of internet and access to internet to the people who can change that data set and participate on it. And if we educate women so that they can all have access to internet, because at the moment, I think 60% of African women don't have access to internet. So that means 60% of African voices are not in the internet. So we just need to change that. Secondly, is the data quality and bias mitigation has to be in the legal framework, because if we leave it to the people that are designing AI, it's never gonna happen. And the human right and ethical guys, this is very serious matter for me. When you look at me, see a human, forget about my skin color. And when you build any technology, build it for humanness with the principle of, in Africa we have a principle of Ubuntu. I am because you are. I'm because of who, you can't exist without me. I think in Japan they have Ikigai. There's principles around the world that teach us as human beings that we should treat each other as human before we execute anything. Because I'm a firm believer of technology, so the other side of me feels like, yay, we should have AI. But then I see the reality of it and I'm like, no, it's just that they're thinking I'm black. If they were thinking of humanity, this thing will be yay. Or if they were thinking of the planet, this thing would be yay. So I think we should just change our mindset.
Thank you, Bartang, and for very eloquently highlighting the key concerns that we look at, like how do we make the discussions more equitable, how do we make it more balanced, how do we make it human-centric, more importantly, like how do we bring focus back to the humans in this all debate about machines, algorithms, data sets, and software that we are talking of. So that's very, very pertinent, and that brings me to to like a very pertinent question, and I'll come to Karen once again to you. And OECD, like when we are working with the international community for developing international standards around AI and how AI should be developed and how we should have standards for AI regulation, standards for AI development, deployment, testing of softwares, metrics about measuring what the AI models are doing. And very often we are doing that, we are in a way thinking of measuring the unknowns. So when we do such development of AI standards, how do we balance what the voices that Bartang mentioned? How do we ensure that the voices of the low and medium income countries, how do we ensure the voices of global south are also represented when we are developing the standards which will ultimately apply to the whole world?
So this is a really important question, and I think the reply is really dialogue between these different countries that are going to have different priorities and have different red lines, and that are going to have different needs. But the needs, they'll have different needs, for example, in terms of access to compute, in terms of access to skilled labor, in terms of access to data. And so how do and importantly, they can very much learn from one another. And so that's really what the OECD is about countries learning from what works in other places that are similar, and what can countries do to improve. And I do want to agree with what was said before, that regulation and or standards are really very important to allow to provide a level playing field for companies, so they're not competing in a race to the bottom, and for countries as well. And it's incredibly important, because the impacts on economies and societies really require some guardrails, so that we make sure that AI is human-centric. So we want to, at the same time, strike that balance in regulating AI to some extent, and also promoting its use for its incredible beneficial uses. And that's doable, but it's hard. So I think the thing that what we do at the OECD, which is we agree on some red lines. We have to agree on some red lines. Where do we not want to go with some of this technology? And then another thing that's very important is it's very important to regulate at the right time and not too early, because we're not sure where this is going exactly, but not too late, because then we've already got systems that are out in the wild and they're impossible to govern. And also we don't, at the beginning we really don't want to stifle innovation. And so what I agree again with what's been said before, that in the case of AI, because it's a general purpose technology that can be used for so many good and bad applications, but particularly good, it's very important to adapt any kind of intervention, a policy intervention, to the context and be proportionate to the level of risk. I think I'd like to continue on the measurement component, which is really, really, really important. The monitoring and reporting is critical. We can't, and I totally agree. You can't improve it if you can't measure it, or you can't regulate it if you can't measure it. But we do have measurements. We do have some evidence, and that's what we focus on a lot, is really on monitoring and reporting. For example, using live data on OECD.ai, where we're tracking things like trends and data at national level on venture capital investment in AI, on types of research conducted, on skills and jobs, on patents, on compute capacity per country, so that and cataloging national and sectoral policies on AI governance. And this is all to enable policymakers to look to research and analyze approaches. Usually they'll do that by comparing themselves to similar sized countries, similar profiles of countries, and see what works and what hasn't. Second, we also develop foundational sort of frameworks, such as the classification framework for AI systems, which really pinpoint, well, okay, in an AI system lifecycle, what are the risks associated with data specifically, and what are the benefits associated with data specifically? Why do they matter? So we get into that kind of detail, so that to reach that common understanding of what is it we're talking about, and where are the strangle points, or the points where we have to be particularly careful. And then third, I think working on international interoperability, as, for example, in the definition of AI, the work on responsible business conduct, which we think is very important, and for example, incident reporting. So we think things are going to go wrong in specific sectors, and there's an annex in the EU AI Act which lists high-risk AI systems, but do we really know that those systems are going to be the ones that are going to be problematic? They might, and they might not, and we don't know what systems will arise next year or even later this year. So what we're doing is tracking incidents. What risks have materialized into actual harm? And that's what we care about. And then in terms of metrics, we do have a lot of metrics. We have procedural metrics, impact conformity assessment checklists, and so on. We have lots of proxies indicating progress towards objectives, like in terms of R&D, workforce development, skills, and so on. But the one thing we are missing, and where to date there has not been very much, there have been perhaps insufficient efforts, is investing in the development of technical metrics for AI systems. So we have these blind spots, and we're working hard to obtain metrics and proxies for those, so that we can, base things like explainability, fairness, energy efficiency, and so on. So we're lacking a lot of those, and that's where we need to focus, I think.
Thank you for highlighting all the ways. So Mary, you want to add something there?
If I could just really quickly, I do remember that chatbot back in the day. I would say, I just have to say, we've learned a lot since then. Janine talked about dialogue. I would say diversity. So the teams are much more diverse back then. We're not as diverse back then as they are today. And we employ, it's a really important value for us as we develop these products, because, in those early days, those kinds of products occurred, or those kinds of incidents occurred quite frequently. We now employ something called red teaming, which I'm sure Google is very, very engaged with too, where we bring people from very diverse backgrounds and very diverse skill sets to really try to break the system, to really try to find gaps and mitigate those gaps. And that's a very important part of the development that exists today, which didn't back then. And I would have to say, Berateng, if we're not working already with you, we should be. And you can come work for us anytime. But if you won't, then I'd love to take your card afterwards.
Thank you, Mary, for adding that perspective of diversity. David, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, all the points are terrific. When I think about sort of data and product design, I think there are a couple of issues that you and others talked about, right, which is what's available on the crawlable web, right? And this is a big problem, and we see it with an issue, for instance, around like image generation. And our early image generation tools, first of all, language inclusivity is not there, right? So, and this issue is very familiar in India, low resource languages. So what again, this goes back to government policy as well, but actions by multi-stakeholder groups to make sure, how are we, of course, you ultimately address that issue by more people online, more inclusive internet. But even before that, there are steps that you can take to bring more languages in, more diverse image databases in. But what happened in earlier versions of these systems is, right, search for a doctor. You know, let's generate an image of a doctor, a professor, you know, and it is white men or men in suits or whatever it may be, right? Or business meeting, right? So a lot of these things which, I don't know, you know, both looking at early internet as well as like Hollywood movies from 20 or 30 years ago, I mean, it's very cringy, right? So I think it's both building diverse teams, but then being very intentional on how we build products, both on the data input side, but then on the output side as well, that we have filters. So there are sort of, I think, social and team solutions to this. There are also technical solutions to this, and we need to build in those checks and balances across kind of the technology value chain.
So that's the way, like very often what we hear is that when the governments and the regulatory authorities and those bodies developing standards, they say that these have to be done, then mostly the companies who are doing it, they respond by saying that yes, we have diverse teams and we have tried to keep in these filters in order to ensure that if the data input, the input data that is there has got biases, we still try to filter those things out and try to make things more balanced and more equitable and more fair. But I come to Sue Delhi here. Like when you hear all these conversations and when you see the way the big tech especially is complying with the standards or the regulation that is coming in, does it increase the cost of compliance, especially for smaller companies, smaller businesses, startups? How do they then compete with? On one hand, we have the requirement of ethical standards and requirement of compliance norms, ensuring diverse teams and all. And very often companies like Microsoft, Google, they will be able to do that. But how does the smaller companies, new companies, upcoming companies, startups who are also building similar solutions, they view it and how do they handle such challenges?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's probably a question that we'll have to continue to ask going forward, particularly as all these developments and the regulatory framework continues to evolve and moves forward. It's an issue that we at Tech UK look at all the time in terms of how we advise on what governments are looking to do, to think about what this means for the innovators and the SMEs that are part of the AI ecosystem, the digital ecosystem. I think similar to some of the other panelists, we have to look at what we already have and perhaps also look at the approaches that we already have. So we had a similar challenge when GDPR, when the data protection, the EU's data protection framework was introduced, that's now obviously been replicated in other areas. So, you know, how can you make compliance, we always say easy, not hard. Standards come into that. There are other regulatory approaches, codes of conduct, certifications that can help people and organizations to comply with what they need to do. But again, it's that clarity and certainty of, okay, if I'm working in this particular sector or I'm working in this particular area, what do I need to do? So a risk-based approach is absolutely key. There'll be some high-risk areas where more compliance may be needed, but let's face it, there's lots of AI tools that are going to be used in very low-risk areas, so perhaps it's getting the compliance right in terms of making sure that the burden is not huge for a general-purpose AI that may be used in a very low-risk area compared to high-risk, and that's, you know, we very much support a risk-based approach that will help those innovators and help all companies to comply with what they need to do. But it's a challenge that we'll need to do and we'll need to work on together, and perhaps GPay can help with that through its research and through its work to identify and share examples of best practice from around the world of how can you do this and how can you do this well and how can you help people to comply going forward. I just wanted to say, though, just sitting here reflecting on, I'm sure you'll agree, a fascinating conversation. I'm a swimmer, so I'm trying to think of a half-pipe analogy for swimming, but I haven't got there yet, David, but I'll let you know. But I was just thinking that there's a lot of work that's already being happened, of course, with the wonderful work of the OECD, with the UN, with the EU's AI Act, the UK's approach, the G7, the G20, the White House approach. There's lots of exciting approaches going forward. But I sense that now this is the hard work now. We have to really get into the devil of the detail about what these initiatives mean. But what I'm holding on to, as to your point about how do we keep humans and human values at the core here, is that all the different approaches that we're seeing and have seen develop are really embedded in those ethical principles that we've been talking about since at Tech UK since 2017. We held a digital ethics summit since 2017. We had our 7th one last week. Those ethical principles of explainability, of transparency, of safety, security, accessibility, those have been around for a long time, and they are embedded in the OECD principles, in the EU's approach, the UK's approach, the UN's approach, the G7, the G20. That's the good thing, right? So it's not the answer, it's not a silver bullet, but we're embedding those principles in from the start. Now the hard work is how do you operationalize them? How do you put them into practice? And obviously that's part of GPA's, at the heart of it, how do we turn theory into practice? So I think there's a real opportunity here for us to learn and share. But I'm sitting here thinking, the good news is we have those ethical principles and they are our starting point. It's just what we go forward from there to how we get it right.
Thank you, Sue, for putting it. So Thomas, hearing all these conversations with regard to the need for regulation, the need for governance, the perspective from the big tech, the concerns from the civil society and Tech UK, how do you synthesize all of it when some Council of Europe thinks about laying down its principles, laying down its guidelines, which is more inclusive, which is applicable across the world?
Yes, thank you. What I keep finding interesting is that in all these discussions, but in also all of these frameworks that we normally talk about, there's one important element missing. We're talking about like binding or non-binding guidance and rules, but there are things that are happening outside these rules. I'm talking about using AI, like other technologies, to kill people, to fight wars, and so on. And I think this is something that we really have to think about and act, because if we don't have shared values, none of our frameworks will be respected by those that think they can win something that they couldn't when they would have to respect the frameworks. And it's like with children, everyone that has power abuses it just because he or she can, unless there are rules that the others create something that make people stick to rules. I think this is a fundamental thing that we need to defend, our rules-based global world order on a global level, but also then when it comes to fairness and solidarity and other values, and let's say constructive competition, whatever, that these things won't work if we don't make ourselves stick to the rules. And then the question is, how do you develop such mechanisms that where everybody is somehow represented? And in the internet governance world, with institutions like ICANN and others, we do have some experience about how to try and do not just inclusive dialogue, but also how to have other stakeholders than governments participating in the decision making. And in many of the UN processes, like ITU has developed stakeholder participation. In the OECD, you have all stakeholders present. But in many areas, you have the governments that take up 80–90% of the time. Normally then among these governments, it's developed governments. And then you have some time, we need to listen to non-governmental stakeholders, to business. Let's listen to what they say. But then the processes are not really made in a way that their voices, even if they can express their voices, that they make it into the decision-making. Also in the UN, there are some consultations. We have spoken to all stakeholders. But then in the end, governments tend to look at other governments' positions, and in the nice compilations of civil society and businesses that are somewhere on a website, you forget to actually go and have a look there. And this is something that we need to improve if we want to avoid that some people are the data, whatever is relevant, does not only reflect the minority of the people and their lives, but also the others. We really need to work on our governance mechanisms to create incentives that businesses and governments are forced to take into account those that have not been heard so far. And I think this will be one of the key challenges, in addition to strengthen a rules-based governance models, also to strengthen really inclusive governance models where all stakeholders are forced to listen to each other, knowing that the roles are different. For instance, at the negotiations at the Council of Europe, any civil society, any business, any academic institution can become an observer and sit in the room and make text proposals and criticize the proposals that come from government. Of course, and this is painful because it doubles the time that you need to discuss something, and sometimes they have illusionary proposals that they insist on, but in the end it raises the accountability of governments. Of course, governments are in the end the ones that will sign this treaty, and as if you work for a government, you know it's actually your parliament that will have to ratify it, so you can't just go for anything, you have to measure it down to something reasonable. But just the fact that they are sitting in the room and negotiating with you to some extent forces you to not ignore certain issues or get a certain balance right. So inclusivity, meaningful inclusivity is one thing, and defending a fair and rules-based order where you have principles that everybody can agree, but then leave it up to the culture to define the how to implement the principles is something that we are also trying to contribute to with this convention. Again, that is not a convention for Europe, it should be a global convention, open to all countries and all cultures that respect human rights, democracy, and rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you. In fact, that brings me to a very important aspect. Like, if it has to be a global convention, where do we house it? If it has to apply to all countries, where should it ideally be placed? And that brings me to Amandeep Garg, the tech envoy to the UN Secretary General, who has been the part of the UN. He's been a diplomat with more than 30 years. He was heading IDEAR, which is the health AI now, the CEO of that, and he has been at the cutting edge of this discussion, and very often has felt that what is the role that UN could play in that. So I would ask Amandeep to share his insights in what ways UN can help shape the discourse around universal AI regulation governance framework.
Thank you, Abhishek. It's a pleasure to be here at GPay, and congratulations to India for hosting this summit. There are a couple of special things about GPay. One is the multi-stakeholder model, which previous speakers have referred to. The other is the attempt at inclusion. So you have countries not only from the global north, but some important players from the global south, and that's to be appreciated. And I think, going to your question, the ideal place where we can bring everyone together is, of course, the United Nations. We can have G1s, G7s, G20s, G29s, eventually G193 matters. And there are a few strengths that we can leverage when it comes to AI. First is, we don't have to reinvent principles. The principles are there. There is, as Thomas mentioned, there's rule of law, there's the Charter with its principles. There are the human rights conventions, which give you a pathway to accountability. There is the Sustainable Development Goals framework, which provides you with purpose for AI. So why are you doing AI? To develop cool products and services, make a lot of money, but also to solve societal problems. And Anandan is here, thinks that Vadhvani AI is doing in agriculture, in health, and in other areas. So that's an example. So the SDGs framework gives you the purpose also. So you have the principles, you have the purpose, the why of what we are doing. And then going back to this discussion on standards, on regulation, we need to bring things together. Standards is not only about, let's talk to each other so that our standards are understood better. It's also about developing standards together. And we can leverage the work that's been done for decades in the ITU, in the ISO, in other standards developments organizations, including multi-stakeholder ones, IEEE, and so on. So there is a set of practices out there that can be used to develop and harmonize standards. And then some of the standards being talked about today are, frankly, that's good engineering. When you build a bridge, when you design a building, there are certain standards and principles you follow. So you're not doing anyone a favor there. They have to be done. When you're developing powerful technologies, Some engineering design standards, safety, testing, red teaming, all those, for me, that's a given. It's not a favor to anyone. I think what we are looking for is what lies beyond that. And that requires a conversation, an inclusive conversation on risks and challenges, not only the immediate risks or the far into the future risks, but all kinds of risks, a full spectrum of risks. Who defines those risks? Because behind the risk conversation are interests. So I think the UN is the place where you need to have these conversations, and we've started that off with the Secretary General's high-level advisory body on AI, whose interim report is due in just a couple of weeks, and working with the OECD, the Council of Europe, the European Union, significant jurisdictions, US, China, India, Brazil, who are working, ASEAN, who are working on these technologies, the private sector and others. So it's time to bring it together so that there are no regulatory gaps. There is no regulatory arbitrage, which creates accountability gaps, which creates the potential for misuse. And most importantly, we can allow everyone to take advantage from this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And we have a break before we... Okay, no. So before we do anything else, I would like to have Bartang to respond to. You said something very strong and very important, and we have heard from everyone. What do you think? What do you think? Is there a hope that this technology will be more inclusive and more fair than what earlier technologies have been?
When I'm listening to them, I think there's hope. I believe that tech on its own, let's forget about human beings because we just screwed up. But tech on its own, if we go around building it the way we are, Mary said it, so like with stakeholder engagement and getting everybody to build it and make sure that we mitigate that bias is not included. Tech will be able to survive and change the world because it's meant to solve problems. However, the people that implement it, I'm going to go back to my original saying that we need to educate people that are implementing the tech itself, because the implementers, it doesn't matter, you can build the algorithm, it's still going to be stable, you can change it, you can tweak it, you can do whatever. It doesn't change how I'm treated by tech at the moment as a black woman. It doesn't change whether I'm going to be employed over a young white man sitting in the room, because the data in itself has such a lot of bias baked into it. So we change that, and then we have a better future. Tech will change, and it will make, it's like an equalizer that will be able to help us achieve what we want to achieve as human beings. And then we have to have mental health, wellness training for human beings to change their biases and implement tech properly.
Thank you, thank you. So we have had 2 rounds of questions. Now we will open it up to the audience for their questions. Yes. We have a mic which can...
Yes. Yeah, thanks for the wonderful discussion. I'm Anandan. The question I have is a little bit of a dilemma. See, in order for us to leverage the power of this technology, in particular LLMs and the generative AI, but all of it really, the more everybody can use it and build solutions to their problems, the better it is, which means some kind of an open sourced approach, however managed it is. But then the dilemma is, potential weaponization, potential misuse of exactly the same thing. And we have this in front of us, a very, very powerful technology. And to go back to what Bartang said, to some extent, it's not Tay itself, but it's the way in which it was used and attacked by the people that used it. How do we balance between the need to, to provide the opportunity to build great solutions with the risk inherent that anybody can use it with any kind of biased data that they have to weaponize it? How do we control that?
David, you'd like to take it? Who?
I don't have an answer for you, but I think you just laid your finger on a huge issue that we have to grapple with soon, very, very soon. The fact that AI has developed in an open source manner has been, just like the internet, has been in some way a happy accident of history, with this, academic ethos of openness and of sharing and of building upon one another. And now the many very of the experts, the top leading AI experts are saying, well, maybe this is now too powerful to let it loose, because we don't have any way, once an open source code is out there, to then enforce any safeguards whatsoever. So just to say that I think you laid your finger on the problem. That's the problem. That's something we're working on right now. But we don't have. So we just have the pros and the cons. But in terms of what do we do, we don't know yet.
I like India's DPI model. I think it's somehow try to address what you are asking. Everybody's data is there. We're working with the fair data. And then the other thing that I wanted to say is, at the same time, we need to educate people. If you have, especially women, if you have women that are uneducated, that are illiterate, that are not participating on the internet, you're literally leaving people powerless, and you expect them to play at a high level, which is like decision making so you have a situation where Baratang is always put in panels to speak about women instead of speaking about important issues. It is important to me, but that's the situation, because now you have a few powerful women sitting and speaking, whilst we could educate everyone on just basics. So invest in basics, infrastructure, give people computers and internet, guys. It's not a big machine. It's just a simple thing to do. I know Microsoft and Google and everybody can do that. Skills and access to knowledge.
And I would agree with you. I would say very quickly, open source is a positive thing, but it doesn't mean if you're open sourcing something, you're totally immune from laws and regulations. So, we still have a framework to apply. So, for example, Microsoft GitHub is the largest repository of open source code in the world, but there are still some regulations. So let's celebrate the innovation that open source brings and the ability of developers to work together, but understand that there still are regulations and enforcement that should apply to maintain basic human rights, basic legal rights of people, and to guard against physical and psychological harm.
I would quickly like to add give you the example of the knife for this question. Knives are great tools, and they're getting better. There's very sharp ones. There's all kinds of knives, and it's the use. And you need to teach your kids for what a knife should be used, how to hold it, how to keep your fingers back. If you hurt yourself with a knife, then you go to the doctor, but you don't go to jail. But if you hurt somebody else with a knife, you need to make sure that then something happens, that the other people around step in, that that you go to jail. Some uses of knives are considered criminal. But for instance, in my country, we have a growing number of teenagers, in particular male teenagers, that wear knives because they think that they are somehow stronger in certain situations. And then there are some accidents that happen in group fights. And you can't have police everywhere all over, or it may be difficult also to forbid teenagers to have knives, but they need to learn how to deal with it. You need to create incentives that the group pressure goes against the fact that they think that that makes me more male if I have a knife, but maybe that this is rather a sign of weakness. And so there's a mix of measures that you need to work on, technical, legal, and cultural measures to prevent people from doing bad things with any kind of technology. And I think AI is not, and the concept level is not different. Thank you.
I would just say very quickly, specifically on the question of open sourcing of the most advanced models. like most dilemmas, there's not one answer, right? And I think we've had a public debate of, very loud pro-open source, anti-open source. There are real considerations that need to be weighed, and this sounds like a punt, but we actually need like a multi-stakeholder discussion because you talk to the national security people in one corner, the development people in another corner, sort of the technology developers in another, and we all think we're doing the right thing, but you stand where you sit. So I think you actually need a full multi-stakeholder conversation on that, but it's going to be a nuanced answer and approach.
Just very, very quickly, I agree with all the points. Just going forward, though, as we have that discussion and as we unpack this issue, we have to get the narrative right. It's not open source bad, everything else good. So and I completely agree with David, I was thinking about it the same, it's about how do we bring that open source community more into this AI regulation governance, and particularly the risk management, the risk-based approach conversation to getting it right. But we've got to start from, and I think we've got to get the language that we use, the terminology we use, and perhaps the messaging that we use out to the community, that it's not this is bad, this is good. It's how do we all work together to make sure that we all get this right, because that's what everybody wants to do.
Yeah, thank you. And I think some of these questions will be answered, because in the beginning of the agenda, we did have a plan for a keynote by Amandeep, and which we did not start with because his flight was delayed. So I would request Amandeep if you can have the keynote, and then we take the questions, because some questions may relate to what he will speak. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and apologies to all those who wanted to ask the questions straight away. Hold on to them. Congratulations once again to India, and Abhishek, to you for getting this together. GPay has many strengths, and one which I neglected to mention while sitting down with the panel is this focus on multi-stakeholder analysis, research, and making knowledge available on what's the direction of technology, what are its applications, what could be problems, etc. So this is very, very valuable, almost like a global public good that GPay is helping produce. At the United Nations, there is a very important process underway that's related to the Summit of the Future next year, to put together what's called a Global Digital Compact. It will be a leaders level document that talks about all the digital challenges and opportunities we have, including AI. So in that context, the work that I mentioned briefly of the high-level advisory body on AI assumes greater importance. So the report of the advisory body will feed into that process and will allow the international community in that grouping of 193 to take certain decisions, if it so wishes, to put the international governance of AI on a solid institutional basis going forward. Now, what are the substantive areas that are under discussion, under consideration today? One, of course, is the area of opportunities. I think for many in the global south, in the developing world, these technologies are seen as an opportunity to leapfrog existing challenges, bottlenecks around infrastructure, government capacity, human resource, availability of capital, etc. So it's natural that the mood is more positive in certain parts of the world, and therefore we need to think about what are the areas where the opportunities are maximum, where there is low-hanging fruit. Is it agriculture and food security? Is it health, public health in particular, the last mile gap in health services delivery, education, the green transition, etc. And then more importantly, we have to ask ourselves what is needed to realize those opportunities. So today you have a problem with compute resource. So for the next 2-3 years, you're not going to be able to get the GPUs that you need if you're going to do this in a massive way. So there is compute resource, there is data. There are only a few places where you have that scale of data sets. The the possibility of using almost internet scale data sets. Most other places you struggle, including in Europe, in India. So an effort is needed to bring public and private data sets together to create the right economy, right ecosystems around data, so that people can share data without fear of privacy being compromised, data being misused, or value being extracted unfairly. So there's a lot of hard work required. So this is the next paradigm, going from the identity layer, the payments layer, as in India they say the data empowerment and protection architecture. So I think that's key to realizing the opportunities. And then there is human resource, talent. So we need a special push, and the SG's high-level advisory body has been looking at this to nurture talent. Talent at the junction of agriculture and computer science and modeling, health and AI, and so on. Now, there are the aspects related to risks and challenges. So, opportunities and enablers, risks and challenges. And there's a nuance, because challenges are important to consider for governments and all stakeholders. The speed of tech development, the opacity around some of these models, etc. And risks are obvious. The short-term risks around bias, discrimination, exclusion, misinformation, disinformation. I think the Prime Minister of India spoke about some of these risks yesterday. And then you have medium-term risks around displacement of jobs, the impact on the social contract, the impact in terms of our societal relationships, mental health, societal well-being, as more and more of human interactions are mediated by agents. And that's the coming wave in generative AI. You have longer-term risks around weaponization, that's mentioned in one of the questions, loss of control. For example, if you use these technologies at a massive scale in the financial sector, and if you have loss of control, there could be implication not only for the capital market that's immediately implicated, but it could have global implications. It could even lead to dramatic situation in some parts of the global south. And we need to kind of have a common framework for assessing these risks and land them in the right context in different regions. Because if you are more of an open source champion, you are likely to handle short-term risks better. More eyes on the ball, on the challenges. But if you believe in the kind of longer-term existential risks, you like to restrict who holds these technologies. So we have to be able to disentangle this web of incentives, conflicts of interest, and where you assess, where you sit is where you stand, those type of issues through a science-based approach. And the UK AI Safety Summit made a start with that, and the AI advisory body is taking that forward. Finally, I want to speak about the third substantive area, which is international governance of AI. Today, you have a number of initiatives. In fact, last 1 year, there's been a further proliferation of initiatives on the governance of AI. And we need to think about what are the gaps. So if we do a gap analysis, put these 9, 10 major initiatives on the table, some obvious gaps become apparent. One is that of inclusion. Which countries, which regions are involved. Then there is multi-stakeholder involvement, private sector. How is that involved? How is that important stakeholder engaged? And I could go on. So corresponding to those gaps, what are the functionality? If this technology is going to stay with us, if it is going to have humanity-wide implications for good or for bad, then we better get all of humanity involved in this. And what is the best way to do this? So you identify the functions that need to be performed at global scale, and then look at who's most competent to do that. Maybe some of them can be done at the private sector level. Self-regulation, standards, codes of conduct, ways to handle liability, for instance. You don't need to get into those from UN's perspective. And a big chunk can be handled nationally in terms of misuse by persons in your particular legal entities, persons in your specific jurisdiction based on some things that are context dependent. If you look at China's interim measures on AI, they're coming from a very unique Chinese context in terms of challenges to rule of law. Look at EU similarly. So that's the big chunk that you can do nationally. Then there is a minimum irreducible set of functions that need to be performed internationally. And that's where we need to focus our attention on. Is that to be delivered through a single institution? Is it to be delivered through a network of institutions with the UN playing a kind of a coordinating role? So those are the kind of important reflections that we should be having in the weeks and months ahead before the Summit of the Future, before a potential opportunity to take a decision. Because it's very important not to let go of this. The political urgency is there. The tech development is, next 6 months you'll see huge improvements in the capability of some of these technologies that are being put out. So there is this urgency, there's this timing, this opportunity, and we have to get this right. Thank you very much.
Mandeep, for the insights and the overall perspective from the UN side what's there. So we will continue with the questions. I know there are a lot of questions. So what we'll do is that we'll bunch questions in three. We'll take 3 questions at one go so that we can respond to Mac. So yeah, please.
May I ask my question, sir?
Yes, please. You have the mic, so you can go ahead.
Yeah. So, with the advent of AI, there's a number of battles which have started. One is between governance, between governments and big tech. And the second one is between big tech and SMEs. Now, you must be aware that the decision on the EPIC has come from a US court just this morning. I read about it. So, frankly, there's a lot of resources in the hands of big tech, which is data, which is cash flows, which are a number of the best talent, and the SMEs, there's just about hardly anything. So how are you going to balance this? That's my first question.
One question at a time, please. We have many other questions. Yeah. And yeah.
Hello, I'm Dr. Shiva from UAE. Our experience of building an AI platform and a regulatory requirement platform led to a couple of questions. One, I don't think, in my opinion, I think we are trying to regulate a use case around AI rather than regulating the entire technology, because in our experience, when we try to build a regulatory requirement platform, we realize that what is legal, ethical, and responsible in one domain is completely different from other domain or in the region. So I think it's a more it's a use case approach, but involving SMEs in regular interaction. So what's your take?
Okay, one more. Yeah, the lady at the back. Yeah, please. She raised the hand first. Quickly, yeah.
Thank you very much. Shimona from ORF. We've spoken of harmonization and interoperability of regulatory systems, but the fact behind the fiction is that most countries don't have comprehensive regulatory perspectives around AI yet. So in that case, how are we looking at international regulation around AI, and what facets are we considering to be most important? Thank you.
So big tech versus SMEs, what Sue was mentioning, the different definitions of ethics around the world, and international regulatory framework, which we are discussing as part of this. So, David, you want to go?
Sure. Maybe quickly on big tech. All I will say is technology markets actually are quite dynamic, right? No one heard of OpenAI 5 years ago. 7 years ago, no one heard TikTok. That's where the majority of Americans under 25 are spending their time, most visited URL, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, like these sort of ecosystems, unless they're built in a way that everyone can prosper and there's, small businesses can build on broader platforms, those platforms are going to run into trouble. Regulatory scrutiny is an important part of that. We will be sued sometimes. If we've misstepped, we'll lose that. I think you mentioned a particular case. We'll see. That's still in the courts. And there are ways that government policy can promote interoperability, right? Individual consumers should be able to move from one service to another and take their data. We should be promoting open systems. So, you know, I know we will be held to account. We should be held to account. There are fair rules around that. We'll probably disagree about some of the details, but I think ultimately we need policy and rules that promote that kind of openness and interoperability, and that will help small businesses.
Anyone else want to take that?
I guess I'd comment as well as being the other big tech participant on the panel. And I like what David said about this notion of the technology is a platform. So it is a platform where SMEs and others can come to bring their own technology. Now, it is true, you know, just to really state the obvious, that it is quite expensive to build and put a data center in place, and regulatory rules are very, very precise about that. But there are many, many more layers to the stack of the technology. And I think it's really incumbent, but it's also good business for big tech to work with small and medium enterprises and enable openness in that platform stack so that they can build their own applications, their custom LLMs, and, you know, look to, you know, a Microsoft and a Google as sort of a cloud provider to help to support other layers of that stack, which small and medium businesses will play just a tremendously vital and important role in.
Yeah, great. Yes, please.
This is a very important question, this concentration of not just tech power, but also power writ large. And I think governments are waking up to this in every part of the world. And I think tech and the tech sector and the government have to work together. And part of the answer is democratization of the opportunity. You know, whether you believe in open source, open model approaches or not, I think it's important to nurture a broader ecosystem, because there are concerns that even the scope and extent of innovation could be throttled if, you know, the tech development is in a few hands. So this is one of the most critical questions that's facing the international community today.
Yes, please. Yeah.
My name is Rohit Israni. I'm the chair of AI standards for the US, participating in ISO IC standards in SC 42. My question is related to the definition of AI and, you know, some of the concerns that come out of it. And I know OECD revised a definition some time back. In an ISO, you know, we have 50 countries participating. We also had a definition of AI that was fairly broad. Now my question is, we have these broad definitions of AI, and there are concerns around specific parts of the AI stack. You know, at one level, it's deep learning, and at the second level, more recently, it's generative AI. The challenge being, very often, local regulators in various countries, they tend to use the large bucket definition, which is being debated on quite a bit, versus the focus being on specific areas like generative AI, which perhaps need targeted definitions that regulators could use. Because that's where the risk lies, more recent risk. And I think the focus goes into these broad definitions. That's an observation.
Definition of AI to OECD? Yes, yes, please. Barbados.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Andrea Jacobs from Antigua, Barbuda. So I've listened to all of the conversations that we've had, and I always ask people, do you think we're ready for an AI treaty just yet? Just hear me out. So I have the privilege and the honor of negotiating the Paris Accord. And how we got to the Paris Accord was via the UNFCCC. So there were several agreements before the Paris Accord. I feel like after hearing all these conversations that we do have elements that's ready for a first treaty. So to include, for example, definitions of AI, whether it's general AI, broad AI, narrow AI. We can have elements, for example, such as no harm done. different elements such as compliance, transparency. So I think that we are at this stage right now because this conversation is crucial for the success of how we move forward with AI to capture all 193 countries. We cannot disregard and think that because we might not have all the elements ready, that we should not consider having a first dig at a treaty for AI, number one. And it should, yes, be housed at the UN Secretariat. Number two, the conversation which my sister Maya had before Mr. Singh got here is very important. If you look around this room, there are only 2 blacks, I think, in this room. We do not have a seat at the table. None. 0. So all these conversations are being had without black people. And do you know what happens when that's done? It affects us the most. Digital currency, for example, it affects black people disproportionately more than other races. So we need to ensure that when we have these principles, when we set these standards, when we do hire people, that black people, we get a seat at the table so that we could have discussions and informed discussions and policies. So it's inclusive. So oftentimes we are left behind. If you look at all these teams, you're going to see one, if any, at all. So I don't want anyone to disregard what Maya is saying. It is very, very, very serious, and it could lead to a whole nother set of issues. So that is why we also need that treaty on AI. It will at least get us into the space to negotiate what the definition is, to negotiate all of the standards, to negotiate the elements, because a standard for you is different from a standard for me. It affects me differently from the Caribbean than someone from India, than someone from, let's say, the United States of America. It affects all of us differently and disproportionately. So I urge you to consider what I'm saying today, because we need to have these conversations going forward, and I thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Definition of AI and AI which is more representative, more balanced. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. Thomas, I was really interested when you drew on this analogy of previous tech and how we thought about regulating it, because we are 20 years now, more than 20 years, coming up for 25 years, to the World Summit on Information Society, which tried to get us a principles-based approach and a development-focused approach for the internet, and to think about that going forward. And some of the lessons there, I think, could help us as we think about AI governance. And some of the fantastic advantages, but we also need to have an honest discussion of 2.6 billion people still not online. We need to think about the consolidation of the industry of digital platforms in concentrated power. And we need to think, 3, about the fact that we have significant harms online. And we have not been able to find neither national, regional or local resolution of how to treat that, or industry-led. So I do think in thinking about a discussion on AI governance, we should reflect also on that experience, the positive and the negative. I'd love to ask the panel's perspectives. You all talked about the value of a risk-based approach to any sort of AI governance. In that, where is the role of foresight? Horizon scanning or strategic foresight, and who should do that? Where should that be done? Is that a national function or is that a local function? And then my second question to all of you is, you all talked about, and David, you brought out this point about the importance of incentives for innovation. But if we think about AI governance for the public interest, how do we incentivize education and public institutions having the compute resources and the data access to be able to be participating and to educate public administration and officials for the next generation? I don't think I've heard anything, and what I fear is in many of the discussions about AI governance, we're not hearing about public institutions' role in this.
Very good. So very interesting perspective, very interesting questions, all 3 of them. The definition of AI, how it's changing, how it's evolving, then this whole issue about how to make it more representative, how do we ensure fairness, and that's the discussion that we had till late last night when we were discussing the ministerial declaration. How do we make it more inclusive? How do we ensure the global south, low and medium income countries get represented? And this whole issue about how do we empower the public institutions? How do we make them part of the overall AI discourse that is there? So panelists, Mary, you want to go?
Oh, I was just going to quickly respond to the very last piece. As I described the regulatory framework in my early comments, one of the fourth framework should be partnership with public research and academic institutions. We absolutely agree. Probably the most important thing right now is sharing compute resources, which are scarce and are expensive, quite honestly. So, you know, we've talked in India here about, you know, an innovation handshake, the potential sharing, leasing, licensing of GPUs and compute resources, and that, I agree, very much needs to be an important thing. And, you know, we probably should not rely only on private sector to do that. We should really think about government incentives and other kinds of things to encourage that kind of a public-private partnership. And I'll leave to the panelists the other couple of questions.
If I may hook on the question about what we have achieved in the last 25 years or 20 since the World Summit on the Information Society. I think we at that time we developed a vision, which is a non-binding declaration and an action plan. Switzerland, my country, has been the host of the first WSIS phase, and we've invested lots of energy and some resources in not just having nice declarations and nice text, but also to help develop the global architecture of digital governance, which is something that is very hard because if there's no trust among governments, if there's no trust among stakeholders, and this is a question that was raised, who do you trust then, which institution to have a role, have a say? And so far, it looks actually worse than ever before in the geopolitical situation on agreeing on giving power to an institution to do anything that may have an impact. But I think the biggest achievement of WSIS is actually the creation of something called the UN Internet Governance Forum, which is a dialogue forum, which is a unique one where any person can just register. You don't have to pass through a threshold. You can just register. Everybody's has access to the debates at equal level. The sessions are not developed by two countries behind enclosed doors, but it's a community, open up, inclusive process under the auspices of the UN. And we've seen it at the last IGF in Kyoto, where we had, after the pandemic now, over 6,000 people from all over the world, from all stakeholder groups, coming together, discuss AI, but discuss a lot of different things, bringing a lot of different things together. Actually, when Amandeep says we have to bring it together, I think the IGF is a key venue to give voice to people that normally have no voices in other structures, and to bring this together and try to turn this into a holistic understanding. And the IGF also rotates from continent to continent and has normally quite a large local population that participates. So what I'm trying to say is that the IGF has been the basis of a number of activities by institutions like the OECD, Council of Europe and others. When we were discussing the need of internet governance principles, the IGF has created an AI policy network, which may be the basis of not just nice words, but actually also getting principles to action. And just one word about the convention. The convention that we are trying to develop at the Council of Europe is also the venue. The Council of Europe is the venue. If there's no global consensus on an institution, on a UN institution, fortunately the Council of Europe has the potential to include, other than its member states, other stakeholders into the making of a convention, and also in the implementation. So every country that the only threshold is you need to respect rule of law, democracy, and human rights, at least to some extent. That's the entry threshold. But then you can actually develop a global convention, and the Cybercrime Convention, or the Convention on 108 on data protection, are now global instruments that have between 50 and 100 signatories and have influenced national laws in more or less all countries in the world. So this is one of the instruments that can be used until there's a global consensus in the UN. That may take some time. For the time being, the Council of Europe is one of the treaties that can be hopefully developed into a global instrument. Thank you.
Amandeep, the whole thing is about treaty and bringing everyone together. Is the UN think of something?
I think that's an article of faith for us. I mean, there's an African proverb that, you know, alone you can walk fast, but together you can walk far. And in the AI domain, there is already, in the context of the use of AI in military systems, weapon systems, there's a discussion underway. It's in a treaty framework, and it could end in a legally binding instrument. And I think the important issue between the UN context and other areas is that from the word get-go, you have everyone there. So everyone has a chance to participate in shaping governance. It's not that, you know, something is created and it's given to you or it's made open to you. So I think that's very, very important to respect agency, respect diversity, respect different experiences with technology, and shape that into norms that are for everyone. So who knows, you know, where we might end up with, but I think at least we need to start with some soft laws and find the right combination of soft laws and hard laws in the longer run. Agility is an issue. I mean, in the context of international governance, you hear examples like, oh, IEA-like, IPCC-like, ICAO or IMO-like, but we have to rethink these models, or CERN-like, rethink these models in the current context. You can't wait for 6 to 7 years for this kind of horizon scanning that Renata mentioned. You have to have it more like, you know, every 6 or 7 months.
Yes. We take one question before we, and the last round of responses. He has been raising his hand for a long time.
Thank you very much, Abhishek. My name is Juraj Čorba. I am chair-elect of the IGO OECD and representing here government of Slovakia, the EU. I would like to ask one question about the balance between the private sector and the public sector. What we see now in the EU as we are trying to regulate and create a governance model for AI and for digital platforms is that many tasks are actually being outsourced to the companies. In other words, we expect the companies to police the cyberspace, to make important value judgments, to identify risks, mitigate risks, and even self-assess themselves. The question here is, for the companies, how comfortable you are with this trend where governments outsource important decisions to the private sector, and do we have a proper understanding already of the wished for balance between what is the work of the governments and the work of the private sector, given the information asymmetry? Thank you very much.
In fact, very pertinent question, and I must, let me respond to this, because we have been like debating this question not only in the context of AI, but also in the context of building our DPI, digital public infrastructure. Because as you know, the entire G20 and the overall the perspective about how we have used technology for empowering lives, people, and in that, it's not only a government initiative, it's a classic case of partnership between government, private sector, and not-for-profits also, and civil society. And the entire framework is built on a concept of trust, and in the concept of ensuring that the strategic control or the sovereign functions of the government remains with the government, and the other supports systems for making things better, for making things efficient, for improving the citizen interface, that those aspects are taken by the private sector, who do it much more efficiently than the public sector. So it's a class. So there are similar models. In fact, at least in the case of India, we are looking at like leverage the sovereign power of the government where it's relevant, and leverage the efficient systems of the delivery of IT systems, managing projects from the private sector when it requires, and involve the civil society in designing this overall ecosystem, how services are delivered. And maybe similar model will play a big role when we design AI-based systems which impact people at large.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I actually, I guess, disagree with the premise of the question a little bit, because I feel like that was the situation a few years ago. I would say the conversation over the past year has been very much these conversations that my colleague from Microsoft was talking about. It's true, right? We both have had internal AI responsibility governance mechanisms and charters internally for actually many years. And we've worked with outside experts, but really governments have not been so involved in that conversation. That has changed over the past year. And so I think we are seeing, the answer to your question is I am not comfortable with the just outsourcing of that. For instance, the national security issues. Governments are very concerned about the most advanced models and what are potential national security concerns. You know, are we in the best position to evaluate that? No, and that's why like the commitments that we made through the G7 process on external red teaming are for national security kind of risks are very important. We don't have those capabilities, and it needs to be done in a group setting. And my one-word answer to which maybe my OECD colleague was going to say on foresight is, the OECD is the one who keeps us honest on foresight, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering his question, but I was answering a question prior to say, one thing I do know is that we're not going to stop Google, nor Microsoft, nor any big tech companies to be innovative and to move AI speed at the speed that it's going on now. We know that Elon Musk company is going to start implanting some chips on people's brains, and they're giving the permission to do that. So that is not going to stop. It's going to continue whether we sit here and discuss regulation or what. However, at the same time, the UN has, I think that's where big corporates should think about this. We've got the Global Compact that says, do your innovation as long as you follow these principles, which are SDG, Global Compact. Invest in making sure that the people who won't have access are not going to be left behind. So if we all respect each other, I think AI won't be as harmful, and we won't have to risk as much. Then I'm going to support my sister there. Even though we think we don't need it, we need some treaty. That's the only time I feel safe and protected. Any other platform doesn't give a damn shit about a black woman.
Thank you. Want to add something on the foresight thing?
Sure. Thanks. So just wanted to mention that we've been moving from sort of this reactive approach to technological developments to trying to be more proactive and anticipate what's coming, because in many cases actually the research labs do know what's coming or have a strong and the researchers do know what is in the pipelines. And so we've created a group that's focusing on the we have a very large network of experts, of over 400 experts from all stakeholder groups, that supports actually the work of the governments, because the governments, as I think Thomas was saying, governments, talking to governments is good, but it's not going to, you really need a much broader discussion. And so all of this work is supported by experts including technical experts. And this group is focusing on medium to long-term risks of AI, and has, a majority of membership of academic and industry researchers, and many of those concerns concerning the medium and long-term developments of AI were actually raised at the Safety Summit in the UK. So that was quite aligned, and I think that was very important to raise the awareness of those potential risks in a timely enough manner to be able to address them before they materialize, and bring those issues, because you always tend to address issues that are more in the short term, or that, to fix things once something has gone wrong. But here there might not be that possibility, so it's important to address them first proactively. And the second question that I was just going to broach was the question about the definition of AI. And I think you're right that the definition of AI was it was developed in 2018. So there's this question of timeliness, and to develop a legal instrument at the OECD, you need a definition. You need to know what you're talking about. So that was done in 2018. It is a technical definition. It is not meant to be more than that. It is meant to be what is it and what is it not. And as to generative AI, I think you're right. We need definitions that are broadly agreed on what is generative AI. I mean, we all think we know what it is, but could we have one single definition on what exactly it is? And then, so the AI itself, AI system definition has to be future-proof. Otherwise, you're going to be changing the definition every year. But then the specific types of AI, yes, you can definitely define in broader groups. So thank you.
Thank you. I think we have come to the end of this session. It's been so engaging speaking to these panelists and the questions that were there, that I'm sure if we had a couple of more hours, we would have continued. But there are other sessions due, so we'll call it an end here. And maybe this session has made us think more questions. When we get some answers in these subjects, there are more questions that arise. And that's the way it's evolving. And I hope these conversations continue at various forums and we are able to come to a conclusion. So over to you, Sukanya, further.
Thank you, sir.